our CEO, James Felton, um, and who's going to talk to us about how to sell D&I services. Um, we're going to make the most of this time and just give the floor to you, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited with all the feedback, the people who are in the attendance, the people off camera, the people on LinkedIn, and people messaging us, and really to all the panelists. Again, jumping over that 300 mark with DIPs, as you all can see, we start seeing this global coordination across the United States and Canada, and soon Mexico and Latin America and India and France and South Africa. And again, there's some interesting things going on in Australia that we just weren't able to gather and talk about today that echo the inclusion of indigenous communities that we heard about in Canada. There's so much going on because this is such a big issue, not only from a humanistic standpoint, but from a economic standpoint, right? I think the reason we're here and there's demand for this work is because it makes good economic sense. And the fact that we are in a globally connected community and engaged in trade of all sorts of things, right? Things you can touch, things you can't touch, hardware, software, all sorts of goods. It's really driving inclusion because entrepreneurs, CEOs, bankers, you name it, are trying to better identify their consumers, right? They're trying to get things right. And so I wanted to take some time in this pre-forum to talk about the money, because the number one question I get from people, whether they're in a big company or they're a consultant or they finish their certification, they want to go be a consultant, is they're asking about money and how they capture it. Before I get into that, I'm going to share a screen and show you all how Karen and I do it and how the team does it. This is the portion of the forum that we would normally keep specific to DIPs, right? So I just want to give you a preview of what we plan to do in May. So in May, around the 22nd, 23rd, 24th of May, we'll be in Atlanta in person, where much of this has started, even though I'm here in New York today and I'm usually sitting somewhere else most days, or sitting in the airport most days. This pre-forum was really just to give everyone a teaser of how we'll build content in these different categories. We've got so many more things to talk about. We've had a bunch of pitches and offers from folks to talk about what's going on in their neck of the woods or at their companies. But we just wanted to hit these 4 big buckets first. We wanted to hear from Ephinus about the pushback. And if anyone hasn't seen the McKinsey study, go into the LinkedIn group and look at one of the last links posted. We'll post the link here. But companies, even though we hear about a pushback in the news, companies are spending more on D&I, DEI, and B efforts today than they were yesterday, about 60% more. And the reason for that is not necessarily political, right? It's economic. It's because the market demands it. It's because women have autonomy. They're in the workforce. In the Western world, they're going to college and graduating at a higher rate than us. And what us being guys who identify like me, right? And that's changing the whole economy. Also, in every other diversity category, there are more folks coming on board who demand services and products that produce a certain quality of life, right? So if anyone ever asks at any client or internal to your company, why are we doing this? It's because it makes the best economic sense, period. The more people that we include into the transactions of the economy, the better off we are. But I don't mean the better off just that we are socially, which is a proven fact, but the better we are off, economically. As the macroeconomists in the room, and for anyone who hasn't heard me give this spiel, I like to talk about GDP, or gross domestic product, a lot. And if you're not familiar with what it is, or if you're familiar with what it is but don't really know how it works, GDP is just a measure of transactions. So the more I can identify the individuals in my space and transact information with them, goods and services with them, information being a type of service, goods being, products being anything that you can touch, from a Apple to an automobile to a computer. The more that we can do that, the more the economy grows, right? We do not live in a zero-sum game, even as Ethnis mentioned earlier, some activists would have folks to believe. It is good business. It is good socioculturally to engage everyone that we can identify in physical space and time. And that is what this standard ultimately incentivizes. So we started a bit early. We weren't supposed to start this talk until 11:10 Eastern or New York time, but we're about 3 minutes early, so that's a good thing. If everyone's not back on yet, again, this will be recorded. We're going to put it out on a new YouTube channel. Like, this is, for lack of better phrases, we're hosting it, but this is the people's conference, right? It'll be available for everyone to chime in. We want the sort of interaction that we saw earlier, where folks are asking about certain initiatives in certain countries and if they can do it in their country. This is how we'll see growth. And the other thing that we'll do at this conference, outside of growing from a collaborative standpoint, is we'll document the collaboration, right? And so as we build out the book of knowledge around how we implement, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, and justice broadly, right? We will document that here. The core objective of this conference is, number one, to have these conversations, but to be able to well document best practices, pitfalls that we've seen, variations of what diversity is and can be in different countries, right? And so all of those things matter. Even when we get into what the training courses look like, what the certification courses, look like, again, they'll look a bit different in every country. What we've tried to do here in the United States, and via Dawn Bennett Alexander and the team at University of Georgia, they've been a real gem in helping us distribute that well. What we want to do is create a base, right? And as we look at other places, especially places that don't have as much context around what D&I is, right, we want to give them more context. And so again, the structure of these programs will look different. I love that Floria, who's in Germany, if anyone's not familiar, was asking Linda, who's in Canada, about how they do things. I love that Neil is doing a deep dive into the different definitions of inclusivity per language barriers. I love that the French government is looking to gear up and fund how we do this. I love that in South Africa, we can make a similar commerce conversation that we're making in the United States to help trade associations distribute versions of the certification that we have here in the United States. This is as big of an opportunity economically or from a business standpoint as, building the first automobile. It really is, because every institution, whether you're a for-profit company, a government, a nonprofit, a large NGO, they deal in people, right? This is the biggest industry around, and it has not been standardized or professionalized or structured. And that's our real objective here, is to spend the next 100 years, if it takes that long, professionalizing and standardizing how we deploy and engage and acknowledge people across every institution that you can imagine. So with that said, I'm going to go into the money conversation. Let me share screen, and Karen will still be here to beat me up and ask any questions if they need to. But this is going to be real basic, and I'm going to do it in real time. Again, for anyone who knows me, and again, for anyone who's not a DIP who's here, welcome. We're going to show you, if you're at a large company, this is how we'd engage you. So you're getting a treat. So if anyone has been on the website, on the Inclusion Score website, Inclusion Corporation website, and they've looked at how we leverage certification or certifying the institution, we identify some steps that any group would have to go through, right? And so there are typically 6 steps. these aren't the end all, right? These are sort of broad stroke steps. There's some fixins, for lack of better phrases, that will go in between here if you actually engage in a client. So I'm going to go through what this is and then how we actually do it in a more micro way. And if you have questions, definitely put them in here. I won't be able to see them, but I'm sure Karina or Karen will let me know what those questions are. So again, for a company to get certified, which is not every company's objective, right? Some companies, they want to use the ISO standard as a guide, right? When we bring in, folks in supplier diversity at State Farm, they're not necessarily looking for certifications of the company, but they're using the ISO standard to guide how they deliver supplier diversity. And when we're talking to, HR people at Volkswagen, they're not necessarily looking to get the company certified today, right? But they're using the ISO standard as a guide for HR and product delivery, right? So they're not on the supplier diversity track, even though they have a big supplier diversity program, but they've picked the micro piece that they want to start, right? And so the first thing you want to do at any company, and all this stuff is online, it's on the website, but we can make it available. And obviously this recorded talk will be available. You start with a baseline assessment. Now, from a sales standpoint, if you're a consultant selling this, for the rest of this conversation, I'm just talking to consultants. If you're a consultant selling this, well, some of the early pushback, which is not known pushback you'll get from customers, is they'll say, we're going to hire a person to be responsible for this. We're going to hire an equity and inclusion officer, a chief diversity officer, you name it, right? The proper response to that should be, before you hire that person, you need to define the KPIs that you'd hold them responsible for, right? The number one question that we get in this space, which is driving this market, is where do we start and what do we do next? Those are the two big questions. The first one is much bigger than the second one, right? And so you say you want to start with a baseline assessment. Baseline assessment means I'm going to come in, consultant A is going to come into company one, and I'm going to just give them a broad stroke assessment based on the standard about what to do, right? So that they can give that chief diversity officer or that equity inclusion officer, that program manager that they're going to hire, some actual work to do, some priorities, right? What we don't want is for a company, a client of yours, to hire a new chief inclusion person, right? And just let them be as creative as they want to be, right? The reason the standard is valuable, the reason this forum is valuable, the reason we're, I think, just jumped over the 300 number in attendees today per the folks on LinkedIn, is because consensus matters more than your individual creativity, right? Well-intentioned person, they'll fail every time if they're interacting in a bad system. And I'm going to give everyone who works in diversity and inclusion the benefit of the doubt that they are well-intentioned, right? I think that we all mean to do well here, but sometimes our own creativity stifles our company's ability to actually include people. So you always start with the assessment. When a client tells you they want to hire somebody, first you bring them back to, I can give you a POV to guide that next hire on, right? So they should always start here. Even if you're pushing information to them that they don't have, they say, well, I don't really have the expertise to take your assessment, or it looks like a lot. You start them in one place, like the companies I mentioned earlier. You start them in product, you start them in HR, you start them in procurement. And as you'll notice from the standard, for all the DIPs who've been through the training, right, every single one of those categories, of the 4 categories of the ISO standard that extrapolated out into the 32 domains, they'll carry you to a different place, right? So if you start in procurement, and the 4th question in the 29th domain asks you, are you able to tell your supply chain about your internal D&I strategies? Well, first things first, you got to have some D&I strategies. So it takes you right back to onboarding and induction, which asks, how long does it take you to onboard people to those strategies? And you go, well, we don't even have that. So it takes you to domain 7, to inclusive culture, to say, let's start with a couple of employee resource groups. We know if we do that, they'll tell us what our priorities are, instead of a chief diversity person coming out of nowhere and getting creative. And I've even seen it at a large fintech company that creates credit cards that I won't mention right now. They hired a chief inclusion officer who I know. I was at his wedding. And they immediately joined the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, but they didn't have an LGBT employee resource group. And so you got to remember when you're interacting with a client, right, and you're implementing the ISO standard and you're implementing all these projects, you're doing that for a customer. Who is your customer? Your customer are your employees first, and it may also be your consumers and other stakeholders later, right? But if you don't have demand coming from your core customer, which is an internal group, for you to do external things like join the Disability In Chamber or join the Women's Chamber of Commerce, or you name it, then you're misappropriating effort and likely money. So again, you always want to start that client with what we have here, which that basic assessment. Then you go from that assessment, whether it's a lightweight assessment or they really do a deep dive, you want to plan what success looks like. Now they're going to tell you what they think they want to do, and that's great. You have to lead them as a subject matter expert, which you are relative to them. And as you lead them through plan of success and, give them time to speak, take all those notes. What you're doing is gathering requirements there. We call that gathering requirements. After you gather those requirements, you're going to say, look, we have the low goal of achieving at least one level of maturity, meaning they're going to establish a policy. And two out of those 32 domains. That's all we're doing, right? They may be more ambitious than that. Let them be, right? If they are, you put it on a timeline. You put that on a timeline and you go from there. So we're at step 3, and step 3 can happen in the meeting for step 2 or right after it. It can happen via email, But what you're doing, as you can see, is you're guiding this client through. It's not scary. It's not a difficult process. And your contact at the client may actually be a person who is running DEI for the company, right? They may be that chief diversity officer, chief inclusion officer, you name it, which is fine. You're walking them through this, right? The next thing, is you want to recommend that they have someone who is aware of the standard that you're walking them through. That may be a training opportunity for you. It may be an opportunity to share one of your peers in Canada, the United States, or South Africa, or India, or France, or, more countries coming, right? But you want to establish a counterpart inside that company who speaks the same language, right? And so that's an opportunity to bring them back to our core community, right? And then last but not least, these are standard actions. Step 5 and step 6 are things that happen with other ISO standards. So the quality assurance standard, the cyber standard, the environmental sustainability standard, the various manufacturing standards are always building a core manual that company should follow. You're going to take that manual from the standard and leverage these opportunities where you're looking for maturity to start to populate that manual, right? And there's some examples that we have of what these manuals look like. Last but not least, right, we use a sort of 2-factor authentication where there's the lead consultant that is driving this client, right, who says, here's the documentation that my client has that garners certification in multiple or singular domains, right? We bring that back to the DISM forum. We bring that back to our folks here at Inclusion Square, whether it be Karen, who you all know as of today, or FNS or others, right? They're vetting that documentation just to make sure that it's not, as I always say, Word documents with pictures of bunny rabbits. Just want to make sure it's something real. There's something usable for that company, if they choose to share that information at all. But the money is in these first 3 steps. So this is what it might look like in real life. So I'm going to do this in real time. And again, if you got questions, chime in, write them, or just go off mute and speak, or request it. I think Karina can take you off mute. But again, when you look at the standard, each one of these 32 domains, or the 171 elements, the questions from those domains, is essentially a revenue opportunity. Let's assume every question costs you about 5 hours, 4 hours, whatever, 40 hours to engage, right? Because you're interviewing people around the company, you're talking to them. If you're a consultant and you charge a billable rate, I'm going to use a number just for example to do some scratch pad math here. Real easy stuff, right? Let's say you charge $100. Let me take this off of, let me get rid of these numbers. So you got $100 times however many hours, right? That's your revenue stream, right? That's how much you make. I'll even tell you, we would charge a client $250, right? Look, I'm gonna go even a step dumber because that's just how I roll. I'm not that bright. I'm just a process engineer, right? Right. So you're gonna go 250 times 40 hours. It's 10 grand. That's a good number. And whether it's 10,000, rands or rupees or dollars or pesos or pounds, you name it, it's probably a good number wherever you're sitting, right? I'm gonna leave this thing down here in case I need it again, right? So you're gonna make 10 grand. You can have that success planning meeting, and that's at least an hour, right? These are just conference calls, or maybe you're showing up at the client's office. Now, this is a bit more narrow. All of this stuff, these 5 bullets that I have here, planning, auditing, town hall, design a campaign, and start project work, that all fits between step 1 and step 2, right? The success planning meeting it can either happen here, it can happen first, depending on how your client interacts. You got to be savvy enough to interact with them, right? They'll either have this success planning meeting early or late. If they want to have it early, you got to let them know that that's the wrong method. This meeting is just an engagement, it's just an onboarding, right? This initial meeting is to establish, right, the project start date, right? You still want to audit before you can have a success planning meeting, right? Oops. So this should happen. Before you do that, because you can't establish success until you know the domains that the company is most deficient, right? Like Karen and I, we audited a large multinational firm one time. And again, they didn't want to do the training first, and that's fine, right? But they didn't understand the parameters of the standard. And so when they started, we did a deep dive in, and they said, we want to start in HR, but then they sent us a bunch of documents around employee resource groups, which again, anyone who's took the classes that I lead knows a piece of this story. They start here, they don't go into HR. Through the assessment process, they didn't realize that performance management, or what we normally call learning and development, right? Excuse me, learning and development, not performance management, was a part of the standard. And they realized they did have some protocols around learning and development that we could do a deep dive. They had some policies that they should upload and critique. They realized that they wanted to do more work in learning and development than any of the other categories, because they already had some depth there. And their priority was to report some wins, right? They could only find that out after the audit, because usually when a client learns about the standard, it's during the audit. They'll see the depth of it, but it's your job as a consultant to bring them back to earth and say, you don't have to do everything at once, right? We're going to pick a starting point. What we want to know from you is, what's the best starting point? Now, for anyone who knows me, I think the best starting point is onboarding and induction, and then inclusive culture. Because onboarding and induction allows us to establish as much of their D&I infrastructure as we like to. And as a consultant, you can say, look, we're going to help you establish employee resource groups. We're going to go up here to inclusive culture. What you're doing by establishing employee resource groups and inclusive culture is you're buying yourself some allies inside the company if they don't already exist. But you're also going to spend some time, some of these 40 hours, doing that. They're like, well, how many ERGs should we establish? We're going to say we want to populate at least once, we're going to give you a name and a framework for 27 of them, per the 27 diversity types. So we're going to start you there. If you don't fill them all up, that's fine. If you can identify a neurodivergent community or LGBT community, right? Or the various different, ethnic and racial communities, indigenous populations included, right? Then we're going to start you where we can. Usually the ERG that will fill up is the women's group, because that's your largest population that is disenfranchised and underserved. So you start there. From this audit, then you do the planning success. Oops, see, I also can't type, right? Then you go back and plan success. That's another hour meeting. And then you can give that game plan to whoever your counterpart is at the client to ramp up to whoever their superiors to say, this is what we're going to do for the next year, for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years. Then you can also, over those years, plan out, your revenue stream. You can tell them how long it's going to take, right? So this is $40,000 now instead of $10,000. Now you're in the money. And you're basically having a series of 1 hour meetings with this client and guiding them from behind to say, you should do this next, you should do that next, right? But you're using each one of these domains to identify a micro project. Every time you start, you're identifying yet another micro project that the client can get engaged in, right? Where you're going to guide them. Every single time you do this, you may also bring in, again, you're not only bringing in your own expertise as a project manager, right? But you also may be bringing other expertise. Like, let's say they plan this town hall. This is a webinar. Post-pandemic, this wouldn't have been possible in 2019 or 2018. But post-pandemic, you can get 500 people on a Zoom webinar or WebEx or Microsoft Teams or whatever, right? And you want to do an info session about the ISO standard. When Karen and I were implementing Lean Six Sigma at governments, we'd always come and do a big town hall to tell everyone what was coming. Really brief, maybe an hour overview with what the standard looks like, some of the problems that we've seen in the market, right? And then we let them go, right? They're just going back to their desks in their departments, and they're aware of what you're going to do. But they're not your practitioners. You're still working with whoever that core counterpart is to bring in more information. From that town hall, you're going to tell them, we'll be in communication about where we want to start implementing the standard. So you may design a campaign that says we want to build an onboarding and induction plan, right? That's one of the domains, right? We're going to pre-establish one or many, right? Being 27 or more, right? ERGs. So those employee resource groups. Everyone knows that. I'm not going to write that out because I think I'm going to run out of space. Right? You're going to do that. That's work that you as a consultant are pushing back to them. But a lot of you have taken the courses. You should already have that pre-baked. You're just naming them. They're on a document. Maybe this company wants to use some software to empower that. There are a bunch of great companies that are recommended directly in Inclusion Score that do that work. There are at least 6 of them that I can think of that help companies identify and fund ERGs like intranets inside of that company's existing infrastructure, right? However they're hosted. So that's an opportunity, right? This is value that you're giving the company. All the while you're spending up these 40 to 160 hours, right? You're just designing the campaign. And then you're going to email everybody. You're going to email the people from the town hall or everyone to join the ERGs, right? From that, you know who you're going to extract project or service demand from, right? And so you all know when I talk about project or service, I'm talking about those 4 project types, right? Again, if you don't have an LGBT ERG, and I don't want to offend the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, it's probably premature to join the LGBT Chamber, right? You need advocates there. If you don't have a women's ERG, it's probably premature to plan an International Women's Day event, right? So you want to establish who your allies are, and then you ask them, what should we be doing? You're going to already have some ideas because you've been around, you've done some things, but you want to validate that spend so that when you go back to your CFO and say, I want this funded, you can say, our employee body demands it, right? Now you have a mandate to go there. If you don't have people who join your ERGs, you may have to incentivize those, right? You may have to, you may have to design incentives for people to give your feedback, right? Inside your company. And you may do that through, this is where you are really getting to see me screw up, anonymity. Did I spell that right, Karen? Anyway, so you may want to do that. If it's spelled wrong, somebody just throw it in the chat and I'll come back and spell it right later. So you want to give, as a project manager, folks, a safe space to come into these ERGs, because that's essentially what they are. The workplace is not a safe space, and you're not going to make it a safe space tomorrow. I don't care how good you are at this, right? What you want to do is design this space to extract demand for more D&I activity. And so, right, and so you may have to, and I've seen this with LGBT employees at IBM in Mumbai, in India, where they had to create layers of anonymity to get more people to join the ERGs and communicate what they would like to see. And what this company was looking to do was not even join trade associations or things like that. They had a healthcare reorg, and they wanted to understand what other healthcare options this community needed, right? And so they needed the ERG to exist to understand how to help their employees, right? So this matters, right? It's not just for trainings or sensitivity training or sentiment analysis. It's for so much more. And those are some of the things that we want to communicate to further incentivize this interaction with that employer. The last but not least part is a project commencement, right? So you want to engage each client, whether you're a consultant at a large firm like KPMG or PricewaterhouseCoopers, who we work with, or whether you're a small one-person firm, you want to hold the client's hand and implement this as a campaign. So when you start, there's a big communication about what they can expect, right? And how they, again, they being the employees, oops, this is running on too much. I'll put it over here. And how they, the employees, right, can add to documentation. As you all know, DISM is a sort of chip off the old block with IT. And one way we get better in corporate world is we document what goes where, right? It's all an effort of technical writing. What we're doing here, what Gretel talked about with the engineering society, is the reason we are deliberately engaging engineers, not only here in the United States, but we'll share information across the globe, is because they're used to documenting every process at our companies, right? And so we want to document what D&I is, who's responsible for it, at what point do we come back and revet it for change, and who's supplying us more information. That last who are your employee resource groups, or whoever your focus groups are, affinity groups, whatever you're calling them. But this bulk of work right here is worth about 40 or more hours of your time. This is worth about, to the lay consultant out there, about $10,000 of revenue for you. maybe after expenses, let's say you spend on some tech, maybe use an inclusion score, maybe you call us, give me some guidance or whatever. That's a drop in the bucket. It's $2-3 grand. You're still going to make your money here. This industry, similar to cybersecurity and elsewhere, there's a lot of ignorance around what DI is, what protocol should be to manage people. You may be bringing in consultants who are doing executive coaching and sentiment analysis and ERG structure and vetting marketing campaigns and healthcare campaigns and joining chambers of commerce. You'll bring those in for the client, at which point you would funnel those expenses from those third-party consultants and organizations through your client, through you, right? And every time you do one of those, that's a value add, right? Because you're aware of where these assets are. I was just talking to a huge company yesterday, and they had no idea that all these different chambers of commerce even existed. And they claim to want to design a supplier diversity program, but they don't know where to pull verified suppliers from. And so they were willing to pay just to be knowledgeable about where the best trade associations are that validate, again, women-owned and minority-owned and disability-owned entrepreneurs or vendors that cater to them. It's an economic inclusion argument, but the point is that was a revenue stream. Every meeting that you have with those folks, that's a revenue stream. Now, to put all this in context, these 5+ sub-bullets are all really a part of these first 2 steps, right? You haven't even gone to looking at maturity, right? So when you think about how you making money at a place, I would use these bullets, coin them in your own language, right? To start to deliver to the client. I'm going to hold your hand the whole way. Because this is scary. When people see, there are 2 reactions to this big schema that you all see here. The first reaction is, great, there's a standard, there's a way to use it. They like that, right? But the second is, I'm terrified to try to implement it, right? And so your conversation with them is, we can help you do it for the low price of 100, 200, 500, whatever, an hour. I mean, our cost a little bit more than this 250 number, but we've been building a brand for a long time, et cetera, right? But I'm just saying, this particular type of consultant, if you look on places like Glassdoor.com and other places, is a more expensive hourly rate consulting than cyber, than insurance, than engineering. It's on par with legal guidance. It's multiple hundreds of dollars per hour. So $500, $700, $1,000 an hour, depending on the client, it's not unreasonable, right? You could leave with 40 grand for 40 hours if you're able to communicate to them how you're going to hold their hand. So with that, I'm going to pause. I know we got a good 10 minutes left.
Yes, and we already have a couple of questions. KC, if you could open up the mic for those folks who have questions in the Q&A chat. Well, Michelle has a really easy one. She's asking us, are we going to be at NSBE 50, which is going to be in Atlanta in March? So any plans to be with the Black engineers, Jay?
No, not me. I mean, unless they invite me. And I mean, if you want us to be there, we can talk about it. But no plans as of right now. Am I pronouncing this right? Is it Taliesin? I see another question. As someone who's a bit newer on a DIP journey, do you have any tips to navigating the money discussion with companies who may be hesitant to pay that amount? No, so I mean, companies aren't necessarily just paying the amount because of you, again, per your graduate. This isn't like getting an MBA from a school and being, a young person versus an older person. This is really about, they have a demand for this in general, right? And so your pitch to them is, I'm the only one that you're aware of that knows how to distribute this in a standardized way. And so, you are, I think, when you complete this course, I think you're in the, if I recognize the name, in the course in Canada that ends in December, you are the subject matter expert. I think, look, of the 300 plus folks that we have, and these numbers will start to double next year, we have a few MBA programs that are going to start training their MBA students. Some people are going to be better at selling. Some people are going to be better at, operations. I don't know that we can necessarily turn everyone into a sales consultant shark, but I do want you all to understand how the sort of the mechanics of this works. And you all are the subject matter experts. So a lot of the business that we've got over the years, but obviously I've been in a consultant space. I left my regular world work about 15 years ago and became a consultant. I met Karen as a consultant. We've both been consultants. We won't hesitate to compare our method to whatever the current chief diversity person at these companies is doing, right? And I mean to be a bit punchy in that, to suggest that they don't know what they're doing. And if they aren't aware of the standard, when there were about 2,000 or so people, engaging virtually sometimes in what was going on in Geneva in Switzerland, with F&S and company, then there is an argument there that they don't know much, right? So you are the subject matter expert here. And I think that is the number one sell to those companies, right? Because if you ask them the two golden questions, well, where are you starting, right? And what are you doing next? They usually don't have an answer. I've never heard an answer to that across 500 companies. And if you add a third question to that, which is, do you have key performance indicators that you hold your lead D&I personnel to? They don't have an answer for that, right? So your response to them is, well, let's use the standard. Let's not be creative and have someone come in here and make up a framework just because they went to wherever, Harvard. And I've seen that. I have a person I'm familiar with, we're not good friends, who just made up a framework. Right. And, she was selling it because she went to Harvard. And I met a few of her clients, and they're like, we don't know what we can actually do with this. It doesn't help us project manage and deliver our DEI assets, right? And I was like, well, of course they don't. She just made something up and she has a great brand, right? So, Taliesin, I would say you are the subject matter expert, and the best way that you navigate those conversations with companies is to tell them that there is a way to do that. And when you ask them what diverse inclusion means, their answer should be ISO 30415, not some, rapier jazz about what they think diverse inclusion are.
And if I could add to that, you are a part of a community. If there are opportunities that you seek, let the LinkedIn community of DIPs work for you to be able to team up to go after opportunities. There's so many, this speech, this panel was important because it helps us to be able to take this word out en masse, because otherwise we get calls every single day asking us, help us to sell. And so that what you got was really consulting hours from James, because folks who are endeavoring to leave corporate or trying to build their own firm need to know the step by step, and we certainly will help you. So your age notwithstanding, you're in a community with folks you can team up with and go get that work. One more question, and from Sienna, in what you're seeing in the landscape, what are the top 5 issues companies are voicing that they have that the ISO standard and consulting solutions would address and solve for? Top 5 issues.
I think the number one issue is they're looking for a way to deliver and quantify their DI efforts. So a lot of new teams are saying that they're spending, we were just talking with, again, a big company in Massachusetts, they've hired 2-3 people, let's call that $300,000. They spent about a year planning to do both DEI from an HR standpoint and supplier diversity. So they've spent $500,000 and they haven't done a thing yet. And then they call us like, what do you think we should do? Right. So it's crazy when you think about it. That you wouldn't see anyone do this in any other profession, which is why I think this conference, this is us beginning to professionalize. I would not have called D&I people professionals previous to this. And so the number one thing they're trying to do is, how do we rein in costs and put KPIs? And KPIs aren't diversity quotas, right? Or belonging or sentiment analysis alone, right? So the number one thing they're asking for us, how do we deliver this in a systematic way, right? And we hear that from, allies, or maybe they're not even allies, right? These are CFOs who, in most of our interactions, have been straight white wealthy men from the Western world asking, how do we do this? And so they want a framework. You all have to remember, with the ISO standard and DISM on top of it, it's a delivery mechanism for all the other D&I stuff you would do, right? The indigenous stuff, the Asian stuff, the Black stuff, the women's stuff, the disabled stuff, you name it, the parent group stuff, the neurodivergent stuff. This is a delivery mechanism. So that's the number one issue that we get, right? As far as the other, I say top four, we have companies coming to say that what we're starting to see, and again, our market is different because we engage companies often through their insurance carrier and broker, right? Companies are coming to us from a compliance standpoint. Their issue is they want to reduce the risk of either lawsuits or fines. So even while we talk about lawsuits a lot here in the United States, in other countries like in France, we see a lot of fines when companies from the government, when companies are unable to hire certain types of employees, like being unable to hire disabled employees. They're not getting lawsuits, but they are getting fined, right? So I would say those are the top two issues. The bottom 3, 4, 25 could go in a lot of different ways depending on the type of industry. The last thing I'll say is we try to focus on industries that also use standards. So big infrastructural industries, construction, healthcare, banking, manufacturing, the industries that make the world go round. If you focus on those, you'll find people who are familiar with the ISO, who are at least willing to take your call because you're distributing an ISO standard, right? And then they go from there. So I think those are number 1, 2, and 3. Firms are looking for a delivery mechanism that they can quantify. Number 2, they're looking at how to rein in all their spend in other places. And last but not least, they are industries that are more familiar with ISO standards, are more excited to go on that journey with you.
Well,
Go ahead.
It seems like James is echoing something that the Harvard Business Review just released. This article is a month old, and it said that organizations keep asking for and they're funding interventions that don't work. Right. Why they continue to do it, that's why we're here today. Like we're here to be the answer to that. So to your question and to his response, we're not the only one saying it. Forbes is an article out by Jared Atchison that says there were no clear goals, no success indicators. So it's important for you to know that it's not just us saying this, because we could be in this echo chamber of all the DIPs, but there are folks that are outside saying the same thing. If we just knew what to say, that's language for standards. And if we just knew what to measure, KPIs, then if we approach this notion of hiring a chief diversity officer, maybe we could build a path. Maybe that person could build a framework, but they don't have that. And so we are going to be on the front lines of ensuring that those questions get asked, and we're going to measure. Like James is saying, we're going to document this journey the same way they do in other disciplines, particularly IT, to ensure that quarter over quarter, we are making inroads. How are we measuring it? By turnover and by the number of claims that are filed, really the number of CDOs that are hired. All these measures, not just in the US, but around the country, to ensure that the work that we're doing has some traction. We're going to just talk a little. Okay, James, real quick, one more question.
Okay.
Can someone become certified without the commitment to becoming a DEI consultant?
So yeah, the PMI is a totally different institution. There are plenty of PMPs that some of our earliest cohort, I think about people like Russell Fugit, et cetera, who's out in Maryland, were PMPs who saw the immediate use of leveraging this DIP certification with his PMP to push that through companies. But yeah, they're two completely separate things, but it is a similar methodology, right? And so for companies that do use the PMI or PMP style certifications to scale their efficiency and their effectiveness, also companies that use things like Lean Six Sigma, et cetera, they'll be more receptive to the ISO standard for diversity inclusion and how we use that. I think that's totally a thing. The last thing I want to say on, I think it was Sienna's earlier question, is across the board, obviously Karen just referenced those 2 articles, but we were just featuring an article on Forbes that said, again, the exact same thing. All we want to do, and the best way into these companies, or to convince your company, if you're working inside of a large firm, is to convince, all you need to do to convince them is say, this is a methodological approach to implementing our DEI assets in a change management framework, right? That ensures that we're actually going to vet bang for our buck. Because again, a lot of these programs are being deployed and they're not necessary. You can communicate it as a cost savings. You can communicate it in a lot of different ways, but as a business person, I would always suggest that you make the business case first without going into sociopolitics or even using that language. People with collar shirts are making decisions about how to implement D&I, or whether they would like to start making decisions about how to implement D&I based on the cost, the project plan, meaning the time frame that you're going to implement it, right? And what the perceived success is, which is what I talked about in my slides, right? You want to define success and you want to lowball it because you want to give yourself a win so you can come back and build on it. This is not a one and done, right? If you're a consultant, you want to be with these companies for a decade doing this.
That's right.
Consultant, I want to say the quiet part out loud. I know there's some companies on here. This is for the DIPs. The secret is you never want to leave. When I worked with Hewlett Packard, our bosses would tell us, don't leave. If you lose the client, even if the clients go dormant and they're going to re-up and pay you in 6 months for something else, do not lose the client.
That's right.
You always say, we see these articles come out about McKinsey overreaching. They're always in the companies. They're the tail wagging the dogs. That's what we're doing here.
All right.
That's if we're really going to implement inclusivity broadly, right? We have to be the tail wagging the dog. We created this framework deliberately to incentivize companies to play it our way and stop hiring token D&I professionals to make it look like they're doing work towards inclusion when they're really not. Just because you hire a woman of color of a certain age does not mean you're inclusive, right? If you're using the standard, it means we can start the conversation about how inclusive you are. If you are not, do not hesitate, and it's to all the DIPs, to punch that client in the face and tell them that they don't know what they're doing. Because that's what I would do. And I normally get what I want 90% of the time. Be available to take those 10% losses.